Starting now. Fantastic. Well, good morning, everybody. What a pleasure it is to see you all here. My name is Maxwell Marlowe. I'm Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute, and I'll be chairing this discussion on innovation and free trade. Joining me is Alexander Hammond, who is at the Rising Tide Foundation and also a Free Trade Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs and a very successful author, I'd say, of writing Heroes in Progress, which is an excellent book outlining some of the great figures of liberalism, liberty and progress over the last few hundred years. I'm also joined by Cormac Lucy, who is an economist and a columnist for the Sunday Times here in Ireland. And at the end is Lorenzo Montanari, who is the Vice President of International Affairs at Americans for Tax Reform and also the Tholos Foundation. To start off this debate, I'm going to be giving some opening remarks as to the state of innovation and free trade as we currently see it. I will probably refer quite a lot to the United Kingdom, as that is where I'm from. Other stagnant social democracies are available, of course, not just across Europe, but around the world. One of the big challenges facing modern capitalism and liberalism today is this idea of innovation. And unfortunately, despite the great wonders of the world, whether that is from the iPhone, the vaccine, whether that's from new innovations in electric vehicles, really anything you can point to, even AI, we have reached a state of affairs, especially in Europe, where we have now permissioned innovation, to take a great term from one of our dear friends at the Adam Smith Institute, Adam Tira. This is essentially a state of affairs, a regulatory state of affairs, which seeks to preclude permission to innovate, whether that's from big companies, whether that's from small innovators and entrepreneurs. There's a remark I always come back to about the state of AI in Europe. A friend of mine who works at Meta says, America has all of the AI and none of the regulations. Europe has none of the AI and all of the regulations. It is a state of affairs, essentially, that any innovation that is put forward through what we call free market capitalism is stopped at the top by numerous regulations, new laws, and various treaties that are being pushed out across the world. This challenge is less of democratic concern. It's not the people, it's not the citizens of a country or of a political union, that being the EU, which is stopping innovation, that's upset or scared about various new changes to the products they buy, the services they consume, or the places they work in. The main concern is of bureaucratic interference. This is what we would affectionately term in the UK as the blob. That's the regulatory system which encompasses not just Whitehall in London, not just Brussels in Belgium, but also any of the state offices that oversee regulatory affairs. They are incredibly hard to break into and to speak to. They don't want to listen to stakeholder engagement, essentially, this idea that's often put out by companies such as BlackRock, that we need to be bringing all of the participants of a economy together. Instead, they're only after it in their own interests, which is to accelerate the control they have over the economy, to maximize tax revenue and to maximize the power they have in forestalling future growth, because if the economy is growing, there is more to regulate, but it's better to stop that in case things go a bit wrong. We also see this when it comes to, especially in Britain, our land use planning. There is a terrible problem in the UK, at least, of building anything. They're what we call NIMBYs and bananas. Not in my backyard, and build absolutely nothing near anyone, anywhere. Now, this may not usually come into this area when we speak about innovation and free trade, but if you can't build anything, if you can't service your economy with new stuff, then it's very hard to create that innovation and, as I come on to with free trade, to really trade with anyone. This is most epitomised in our trade policy. Now, Britain may have 4.5 million unit deficit with our houses, but really it's the main problems for building data centres, for building new lab space, for R&D. We haven't built a reservoir since the 1990s. Really getting anything built in Britain is part of state policy The state policy is, of course, not to build anything, or at least take so long and make it so expensive that you just want to go somewhere else. I was reading on X/Twitter earlier this morning about Rolls-Royce, one of the great mechanical engineering powerhouses of the world, and they've branched recently into SMRs, small modular reactors. As we will all know, there is a massive energy crisis at the moment, given the war in Ukraine and increased competition for energy as the rest of the world grows. So we should really be turning to nuclear and SMR specifically to fulfill that demand. So Rolls-Royce have stepped forward and accepted the challenge. The British government have decided, in all of their wisdom and might, to not go ahead with any Rolls-Royce contracts. Instead, the Czechs will be buying up British SMRs. Meanwhile, the British market is empty. Likewise, when I speak of the regulators, we're trying to build quite a large power station at a place called Hinkley Point C. Now, the reactor within Hinkley Point C has already been used in Germany, Ukraine, France, and South Korea. We have a state of affairs where we have the reactor technology. That wasn't good enough for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. No. They decided to make over 600 changes costing almost £1 billion and slowing down the project by 2 years in order to mitigate the potential environmental overflow that this nuclear power station would cause. Now, the cost-benefit analysis came out recently. So for almost the cost of £1 billion and over 600 changes to an already perfectly suitable and used reactor, it turns out that the changes made would only save enough fish in the sea next to the reactor that would be brought up in a single trawling session by a large trawler. The cost-benefit analysis is wrong there, and when one investigates a little bit further, it's purely because the Nuclear Authority had the ability, and authority indeed, to make these changes. So we can't build nuclear reactors. Fracking is now banned in the UK. In fact, it was the vote that led to the downfall of Liz Truss. Speaking to some American friends who work in the energy sector, that it is now a fight between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to see who can pull more fracking gas out of the ground. And indeed, the US it's the UK's largest gas provider. I read recently that the US now produces more oil and gas products than Saudi Arabia does. That's quite something. The UK, that's banned. You can't do that. We're also closing down our North Sea oil abilities. We've decided to stop issuing new licenses. So in the middle of an energy war and an energy conflict in Europe, we've said no more energy. Quite genius. It was quite interesting as well. If you see our Secretary of State for net zero energy and energy security, Ed Miliband, who used to be leader of the Labour Party, recently decried that one of these oil and gas platforms decided to close down its operations in the UK, and he was very upset about it, which is interesting because his entire policy so far is to stop the oil and gas companies from expanding. That's the innovation in policy we're seeing. And finally, when we look at renewables and the people who push for renewables, it tends to be those on the centre-left and on the left, the Green Party. There was a very interesting situation recently where a Green Party MP was told off by Mr Miliband for blocking the building of a solar farm in their constituency because it's not in their backyard. Thank you very much. So what we can now see is that it is the state policy of precluding and stopping innovation, stopping the building of factories, of energy infrastructure, really of anything whatsoever. And that has, unsurprisingly, caused serious productivity problems to the United Kingdom. In fact, it was only 2 quarters ago that the UK finally overtook itself in 2007 for GDP per capita growth. So we've had, since 2007, no productivity growth really whatsoever. It's a very concerning situation. So if that's the challenge of innovation, it's of bureaucratic overreach and of essentially inertia within the civil service, what's the solution? The solution is essentially embracing the Schumpeterian growth model. For those who aren't familiar, Schumpeter was an early 1900s economist who basically said the beauty of capitalism is the power of creative destruction. Capitalism is very unabashed about waking up and breaking things, and then innovating for them further. We must embrace that essentially through whether that's reports think tanks do, whether that's the columns written in newspapers, but it's also to say to our policymakers, if we choose to reject the Schumpeterian growth model, to reject the power of creative destruction, and to actually let individuals interact and invest as they need, then we can grow again. You can have the tax money you want for your projects. So that's really the solution for the innovation, and we'll come on to discuss a little bit more. I'm going to come on to free trade as well, which goes hand in hand, because there are new innovations in free trade, either for the better or for the worse. As you will recall, Brexit happened, voted for in 2016. It took about 3 years for it to be properly executed before we hit a pandemic, and a lot of those benefits were lost. The UK stands in a very interesting place when it comes to free trade. It is really the mid-Atlantic child between the EU and the US. And I always find it interesting that despite, all these calls by China and Iran and Russia saying that the kind of Anglo-American alliance stands very strong, there isn't a free trade deal between us and the US. There isn't a really full-fat free trade deal between us and the EU. In fact, it's a great shame that there is no free trade deal between the US, the UK, and the European Union. That, to me, is very strange. It seems as an almost deliberate disempowering of our economies. And a lot of that's to do with how the EU regulates. The EU is a Zollverein. It is a bloc which is there in order to promote the interests of incumbents within Europe. I find it to be absolutely fascinating, for example, that the UK maintained a lot of the agricultural tariffs that we put in place under the Common Agricultural Policy. So, for example, the UK imports 60% of its tomatoes from Morocco. And yet we have tariffs on those same tomatoes to protect the interests of Spanish farmers. We've chosen not to deregulate, and there are multiple instances of this, hundreds of tariffs and regulations that we still have not removed since our days in the European Union. So instead we've looked much further abroad to Kanzuk. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, and maybe Kanzukus one day. This idea of this old commonwealth of the Anglosphere and how we should unite under a free trade deal and hopefully other freedom of movement and capital too. Now, there are large problems with this, namely the fact that our regulators don't really like the idea of this. They want to capture themselves within their own countries where they can have monopoly of regulatory power. As we saw with the formation of the EU and from the EEC, a lot of those powers were centralised but taken away from a lot of national governments. There are also issues when it comes to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization had a bit of an upset about 4 years ago when the United States decided to withdraw some of its judges from the appellate body. And what was replaced is the multi-party interim appeal mechanism, something that the US and the UK are choosing not to participate in, which is actually dragging down the interests of Western capitalism in favor essentially of countries like China, who are able to dominate those discussions. So there seems to be on multiple areas, whether that's on the regional, the national, and the international stage, real problems facing free trade. And it's a real challenge for policymakers and to get onto the policy agenda, really going for full-fat free trade. So those are just my opening remarks. I hope we can expand on them a little bit more. I'd like to pass over to Alex Hammond, who can continue the debate. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Max, and thank you all for being here and indeed for inviting me to come talk. So I wrote a book earlier this year. It was published, and the book is called Heroes of Progress. And it is a collection of biographies of 65 people who saved or improved millions of lives. Most of these people you've never really heard of. Now that book, I wrote it for a few reasons that we can go over in the Q&A or perhaps at lunch. That book doesn't sound too relevant to today's discussion, but the reason it's quite important is because I spent about 5 years with researching people who fit this definition, saved or improved millions of lives. I had many smart people, some of whom are quite high profile, emailing me across this half decade with ideas of people who could fit. We had people like Marion Tupy, Steven Pinker, even Jordan Peterson emailed once to suggest some names, Tyler Cohen, etc. So we had a group of people for a long time thinking of which innovators fit this definition. And I ended up with 65 of them. And I didn't start thinking I'd get to, once I hit 65, I'll just call it quits. It kind of hit a natural endpoint where after so long had passed, so many great minds been looking at it, we couldn't really find any more. And I'm sure there are a few more, but we hit a pretty good point. So the reason why that's, I think, relevant today is because looking at these innovators, you can do a bit of a meta-analysis of the conditions in which they worked, they could flourish, and how their innovations actually happened in the first place. So we've got this collection of people, and I laid the book out chronologically so we can almost track how innovation has progressed over time, where it happened, with whom, the types of people innovating, and why. And there are a few things we find, and the first is the book's laid out chronologically. So I've got, the earliest here I've got is from the 15th century. We got one from the 15th, we got one from the 16th, I think two from the 17th. Then we hit about the 18th century, we're up to about 9 or so. We hit the 19th century, we're up to 20 or so. Then we hit the 20th century, and then we've got about 20 to 25. So these world-changing innovations have drastically increased. And in the book, I should say, some of our biographies, it doesn't matter on what field you're in. It could be scientists that ended pandemics, perhaps like Edward Jenner. It could be agronomists like Norman Borlaug, who, thanks to his hybrid wheat, saved about 1 billion lives, quite important. Or it could be public intellectuals or academics. Like, for example, we have Richard Cobden in there, who introduced free trade into the British Empire, which then spread globally and is indeed what we're somewhat talking about today. So we see the number of world-changing innovations that the modern world's shoulders really rests on drastically increase over time. And we also see, when we look at the early innovators in the book, who's made innovations that changed the world, to start with, they were all virtually European white males, if we go back to the 16th, 17th, 18th century. As time went on, the diversity, and they were also mostly rich. As time went on, the profile of these heroes significantly changed. There started to be several females, and there started to be people from poorer backgrounds of various different ethnicities as well. And the core reason for this, and which probably won't shock you, is as freedom increased across the world, first in the Netherlands, then the UK, then the United States, and then in some places elsewhere, the number of heroes just expanded upwards. And, of course, this makes sense. To innovate, you need a few social freedoms. You need to be able to assemble, to speak freely, to publish freely, perhaps most importantly, disrupt the status quo. There's a lot of entrenched interests whenever you when you're creating a printing press or creating a new vaccine or even creating a flushable toilet, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's a lot of entrenched interests and cultural norms that you have to overcome. And then on the pro-market side, you also need to be able to test the idea, see if it works with a price mechanism, and then save, and perhaps most importantly of all, know you own the fruits of your labor. Because if you don't know if your property is just going to be taken from you, why do anything? So all the heroes in the book came from free societies, apart from about 3 or 4. And in every case of a hero not coming from a free society, these innovators, they did one of 2 things. The first was migrate to countries to find education, to find freedoms, to find resources that they didn't have in their home country. And a good example of this could be Erasmus, who was an early champion of peace and toleration and influenced kind of that political philosophy across Europe for quite a while. He moved back in his day from his native Netherlands to the UK, to Belgium, to France, to Italy, to Switzerland, I think then back to Belgium. And this was all in the 16th century, where moving was extremely expensive, took huge amounts of time, and yet he continually did it. And as the world has become freer, and the amount of heroes who have immigrated has declined, but that was definitely the case back then. And then the second thing innovators have done, if they're not from free societies and they haven't migrated, is they've got special permissions from government. One example of this could be Sir John Harrington, and he is the inventor of the modern flushable toilet, which has of course saved hundreds of millions of lives through sanitation and modern plumbing. He was in the Queen's Court, would be continually kicked out for translating risque poems, basically causing trouble and disrupting the status quo. And yet he was continually allowed back in because he was the Queen's godson. So that gave him huge amounts of privileges. And a more recent example of this special government permission, to know it's not just from the 16th century, is that of Yao Longping. We've probably never heard his name, despite how important he was for humanity. And he was a Chinese agronomist. In China during the Cultural Revolution, he upset some of the local authorities because when he was looking at his plant science, he was more on the Western opinion of how plants develop and evolve and how we can breed them, compared to the Soviet Chinese idea of how to grow plants. And there were such things. So because he was leaning towards more Western, he was denounced as a revolutionary. The local government reserved a cell for him in the nearby prison. And it just so happened that a local official, higher ranking official in another province, had read one of his papers, kind of liked what he was doing, and let him be. Which is great news for Longping. It meant his rice, he could develop his rice. His rice has saved about 100 million people. About 100 million, 200 million people still rely on it every year. So pretty important, and it's great for him, but then at the same time, you can imagine the huge number of innovators that never got that special government permission, had innovations that could have changed the world or gone on to create those, and never did so. So that's the first kind of condition for innovation I found when we're looking at this group of world-changing innovators, is freedom, unsurprisingly. And the second, and this took me long and hard to figure out, but the second one is they all have a human brain. And that sounds utterly ridiculous and obvious, but nations, governments, groups, societies, algorithms, at least not yet, perhaps you could argue now of AI, but they don't make new ideas. It's people, it's the human brain, the ultimate resource, as Julian Simon, an economist at the University of Maryland, dubbed it. He believed humans were the only thing on this planet, perhaps in the universe, that can innovate its way out of problems. He was completely anti-Malthusian, placed a bet with Paul Ehrlich, who's this awful doomsayer, who believes society is just doomed because the population is growing. Julian Simon placed a bet against Paul Ehrlich about the price of commodities, and he said they're going to decline as the population increases because human innovation will increase, and more brains means more people trying to figure out the problems of our world, rather than resources being finite. They're actually more like infinite. It's a mentor of mine, Marion Tupy, describes it as, even though all the keys on a piano, there's only a set number of keys, the melodies you can play with those keys are infinite, and same with resources, in Simon's opinion. So that's the second. They were free, and then they had human brains, quite important. And then the third one, I think, that fits into most of the heroes, is the sheer amount of grit and determination they had. Continually overcoming the naysayers and perhaps societal norms as well. One example could be Grace Eldering and Pearl Kendrick, and they were in their lab in Grand Rapids in Michigan back in the 1930s. And perhaps because of funding, perhaps because of sexism, they weren't allowed to work on a vaccine they wanted to work on during their day hours. So instead, they devoted their evenings, their weekends, their holidays, for years and years and years to work on the whooping cough vaccine. Many years later, they were successful, and to this day, it saved about 15 million lives and continues to save more and more every year. But they didn't give up despite the obstacles placed before them. Same is true with Wilhelm Röntgen. When he told the world about 125 years ago that he could take photos of the insides of people's bodies, people thought he was absolutely crazy. And yet today, X-rays are a key cornerstone of the medical system, and we've probably all benefited from them at some point. And you could go on and on. Louis Pasteur, when he said life didn't spontaneously appear from non-living matter, was denounced as crazy, almost lost his job, and yet pasteurization and the germ theory of disease are, again, likely saved hundreds of millions, if not more. And this relentless work ethic can actually be, in some cases, be pinned to a broader psychological trait, and that's of disagreeableness. And someone who exemplifies this in the book very well is a guy called Maurice Hilleman. And most people have never heard of him. I certainly hadn't before researching this book. He ran a lab in America in the late 20th century. And his lab, his students would say, was ran like a military unit. He had a row of shrunken heads on his desk to represent each of the employees he had fired that couldn't make the cut in his lab. He refused to go to meetings organized by his employers to make managers more civil. And yet, of the 14 vaccines recommended to children in America, he created 8 of them. He created over 40 in his lifetime and has saved, he's the medical scientist who saved more lives in the 20th century than any other. And quite simply, if he was around today, he likely would have been cancelled long before he made his groundbreaking innovation. And this is quite a difficult problem, because imagine you were hiring a Maurice Hilleman figure. He's extremely disagreeable, he doesn't play well with others, not the most pleasant man in the world. So of course, as an employer, you wouldn't necessarily want him in your lab. But then at the same time, we need to have space for these eccentric people who can then go on to create amazing innovations. So that's Maurice Hilleman. And one more interesting thing to bring it into the whole regulatory space is in 1963, his daughter became ill with the mumps, quite a bad illness. So what he did is he instantly drove to his lab, got the necessary tools, drove back to his house, took off a scab of her mump pus bubble thing, and went back to the lab and made the vaccine for it. Like that, very, very, very quickly. Needless to say, and one of his students later said this, because of today's regulation, that would have never been possible. And his daughter called, what's her court name? Gerald Lynn. That Gerald Lynn strain is actually still the basis for every mumps vaccine in the world. So if you've got a mumps vaccine, there's some of that kind of, I guess, DNA still in there from Gerald Lynn, and because Maurice Hilleman just drove in his car after hours back and forth to his lab, just doing his own thing, and, saved millions of people doing it. And I think if we look at Hilleman, this cancellation of his, if he was around today, if he would be cancelled, is quite an unexplored area of a free speech debate. People who are supportive of free speech, there's, all the classic million reasons as to why you should be supportive of free speech. But there is this one where if you cancel people, it could be the case they go on to create a world-changing innovation that saves millions, if not billions of lives, significantly enriches our lives, and yet we put them to the wayside. And perhaps, an Elon Musk-like personality could be an example of this. So yeah, that's kind of the 3 things I found. I'll leave it on a positive note, though, in the sense that I think this is good news, because even though the innovation landscape today, the regulatory landscape today is tough, and certainly some of the innovations that have happened in the past would not be possible today, the good news is the world, at least as a whole, is becoming steadily freer. And as the world becomes steadily freer, you're unlocking the potential of billions of people across the world, especially in Africa and parts of Asia and South America as well, to some degree. So I'm quite optimistic about the future, because even though it doesn't feel like it here in Europe, Africa as a whole, for example, is becoming freer. There's about 1.2 billion people there who can now enter the global marketplace, can steadily, depending on their country, start to compete. And as Julian Simon said, the more human minds we have with freedom to test and disrupt the status quo, the better the world will be. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Alex. Good morning. Cormac Lucy is my name. The agenda for this morning is free trade and innovation. And free trade is clearly economically good. This has been preached by as far back as Adam Smith, and the EU, its economic foundation stone is essentially free trade within the European Union. Innovation is clearly good. Compare the living standards and life expectancy today of a poor person in Western Europe to those of a monarch living in Western Europe 2.5 centuries ago, in 1774. So compare the health available, the travel opportunities available to somebody in a working class area compared to those of George III, Louis XVI, or Frederick the Great. So clearly innovation is allowing a much greater unfolding and development of human potential. So who could argue against free trade or against innovation? Well, I come from the Roy Keane school of Irishmen, so I am going to argue, or maybe not argue against these things, because I do believe in them, but point out growing, looming risks and challenges between free trade and innovation on the one hand, and democracy on the other. Democracy is clearly also something that is good. Edmund Burke, Alexis de Tocqueville, the EU, all very much focused on democracy. Where are these problems that I speak of emerging? One is, if we look at innovation, a clear driver of the Industrial Revolution has been specialization. So rather than everybody being a generalist and no idea or development getting liftoff, we have benefited enormously from massive specialization. The danger that brings today is of a concentration of the fruits of innovation, where if you are the founder of Facebook, you become enormously wealthy. Elon Musk has done tremendous good. I think the area where he has done the most good was actually laying off 80% of the staff at Twitter when he took it over, and Twitter not falling on its backside. I think there are too many large organizations today, particularly in the public sector, where there is just an extraordinary degree of non-performance by staff, non-management by managers, and non-accountability on the part of boards of directors supposedly in charge of these organizations. And if I were to look at Ireland, I'm Irish, we're in Ireland, a massive problem we have in Ireland is grotesque underperformance by the Irish public sector. But if you do not suffer a penalty for grotesque personal underperformance, if you are at no risk of a significant reward for exceptional outperformance, why should we be surprised when mediocre performance is the inexorable result? So I think a concentration of the fruits of innovation, I think that is a potential risk to democratic support for free trade and innovation going forward. I think another big change that has happened over the last 250 years with those advances in our material well-being is the fact that people, unlike 100 years ago even, do not feel under existential threat from the elements. They're not going to die of hunger. And our material needs have been broadly satisfied. So the urge, the impetus to drive hard for further productivity gains has been reduced and weakened. And now society is spending much more of its time arguing about viewpoints. And we have right viewpoints and wrong viewpoints. There's a greater degree today on psychic comfort than on physical advances. And I think this is a problem for the centre-right. we are taking it as axiomatic, as automatic, that people should want greater productivity gains. I think most people out there are indifferent to productivity gains. They see productivity as a preoccupation of the ruling class, not as something that has an impact on their lives, and therefore not something that they should go to the barricades to fight for. I think another big problem that we face in this looming collision between democracy and innovation, free trade, is greater complexity that comes with greater specialization, erosion of democratic control. How can a democratic state control a complex sector such as banking? 100 years ago, what banking did was relatively straightforward and comprehensible. Today, the full extent of what banking does is labyrinthine, and I've worked in banking. And that then means that if we're members of a government, supposing we are all members of the government of, let's take of the United Kingdom, and we're in control of our own regulation, we're not answerable to the EU, and we want to control Britain's banks, the only way we can do this is by developing a cadre of regulatory specialists and handing over to them the task of regulating banks. And the danger then is, of course, that this regulatory cadre develops its own interests and follows its own goals and its own agenda rather than the agenda that we, the elected members of government, have set for it. An additional challenge we're facing is that democracy really only functions at national level. But increasingly, decisions are being taken at multinational level, either at EU level or at a G7 level, and people who challenge these decisions are poo-pooed and told, well, you don't understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. If you knew what the president in America said. And if they become ultra troublesome, they may be suborned into the system. Well, we'll appoint you onto a committee to look at this. And by the way, the president would like to meet you and his wife the next time you're passing through Washington. So this elevation of decision-making to multinational, international level makes democratic control, which really only happens at national level. Yesterday or the day before, it was announced that the next Irish EU commissioner has been given the justice portfolio. And people are going around, oh, the justice portfolio. How important. Nobody can name the outgoing justice commissioner. We've got this fiction of democratic... the Führerin, the EU president, Ursula von der Leyen, unilaterally told nominating countries, without any backing in treaties, that they must nominate a male nominee and a female nominee so that she could achieve gender equality. She was aping her Führer friend over in Berlin, Herr Schulz, who's unilaterally decided we're going to shut our borders because his party, the Social Democrats, have suffered very severe electoral setbacks at the recent local elections in Thuringia. The ruling coalition in Bonn, Social Democrats, Greens, Free Democrats, got an aggregate 12% of the vote. So Germany, I think, has, and ich habe 7 Jahre lang in Deutschland gewohnt, I lived 7 years in Germany, sehr gut. Germany, I think, has got fed up playing the role of the perpetual penitent, apologizing for World War II, and we're now seeing a rebirth of the articulation of German national interest. You can't say this, but it's true. Thanks to the AfD. it would not have happened without the AFD pushing the line it has pushed and other parties now trying to prevent its rise by adopting some of its stance. Now, I would not be supporting the AFD. I think there are dangerous neo-Nazi aspects within that party. But leaving that aside, the question of how do we control decision-making if our politics is operating at a national level, but decision-making is increasingly happening at an international level, that is a huge challenge for how we are going to manage free trade and innovation. And then one thing that we haven't mentioned today, but it is, it's like the oxygen in the air. It is hugely important to our lives. It is present all the time, but it is invisible. And that is global insecurity and tension between the West and China, Russia, and then the lesser Satans, if we use their vernacular, countries like Iran. We've just seen an unidentified Middle Eastern country whose first letter begins with I unleash chaos. Actually, I'll let you hold my mobile phone while I give this part of my speech. They've unleashed chaos by detonating mobile phones in Lebanon. So the technology of destruction is also rising as fast as the technology of good stuff. And the danger is that countries like Iran get hold of this, or God forbid, at least Iran is a nation state and is amenable to external pressure to some degree. But if you get a bunch of radical activists, anarchists, and they get access to this technology, we're going to be in trouble. So I'm worried not about free trade. I think it has proven itself. I think its benefits are absolutely clear, and I think policymakers are clear about its benefits, even if policymakers are sometimes too stupid to avail of those benefits and if they shoot themselves in the foot. Similarly with innovation, I think the benefits of innovation are absolutely clear. The biggest risk is that public servant, inverted comma, regulators get in the way of innovation or get in the way of the transmission of innovation. Where I think we have an additional challenge in democratic control is voters and citizens not being able to act like adults and advance their own interests. So the dramatically increased consumption of ultra-processed foods is an example. Hang on, I've just got somebody sent me a tweet here, I need to read it. The proliferation of concentration-destroying social media. How do we balance up our right as individuals to destroy our own lives and go on social media to order 3 Big Mac meals just so that they're outside here when I finish, with society promoting what is good for its citizens, namely eating much, much, much less junk food. Look at the life expectancy in the United States. It's one of the richest countries in the world, and yet it's got one of the lowest life expectancies in the developed world, primarily because its people eat so much shit. And look at all of our limitations in avoiding social media. How long can somebody go an hour without grabbing their iPhone or whatever and rooting around in it? And to what extent has that then had an impact on our ability to read books, to develop complex thoughts, to act as citizens in a democracy where we are thoughtful citizens taking part in a contest of ideas and policies as to how our community should be ruled. Look at the United States. Their election is a game show. It is, and the irony, I don't know how familiar you are in Ireland, but the Irish mass media is very much soft left, very much, if Donald Trump isn't the devil, he's at least a close relative. And we may not know much about Kamala Harris, but she's not the devil. But which of the two campaigns has the most policy content? By a country mile, it's Donald Trump's campaign. Whereas Kamala's doing the I'm a nice person game show, vote for me game. So I'm worried that I know I'm veering way off topic here, so apologies to Lorenzo, who's got to come after me and clean up the mess that I'm leaving up here on the podium. But we have a society whose material needs have been largely met, which is becoming ever more narcissistic. You're hurting my self-esteem by nodding like that. And people are going around with wounded self-esteem, and I feel hurt, therefore you've got an obligation to fix me. This game show mentality. And then we've got the challenge that has always been here in any society of taking on entrenched interests. So one of the big challenges for Liz Truss as Prime Minister was the middle management of government didn't support her and allowed her fall flat on her face. Now, to be honest, I think she was a terrible choice. But I'll just finish up on one example of the insiders manipulating elected rulers that you are unlikely to be familiar with. And it concerns one of the great sacred myths of centre-left consensus thinking in Western Europe. And it's Watergate. Two aspects of Watergate that you very seldom hear are, in advance of Watergate, the White House was the object of a spying operation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, directed by Admiral Moorer, M-O-O-R-E-R. Look up his Wikipedia page, there's a brief reference to it. And they had inserted a chap called Yeoman Radford into the staff at the National Security Council, who do the strategic thinking for the White House. And every evening he would stay late, take the burn bags of documents to be destroyed over to the Pentagon to be photocopied, and bring them back to the White House for eventual destruction. And this ring was uncovered by Nixon, and this just shows you Nixon's power as a politician. What did he do? Did he sack Admiral Moorer, execute him? No. He left him in position. When I have a man's balls in my hand, his heart and mind are sure to follow. So he left him emasculated in office. That's one thing you don't hear about. And the other thing you will never hear about is that in advance of becoming a journalist, Bob Woodward had worked as a naval reservist. He had been a White House briefer, meaning he was in the Pentagon. There were 5 or 10 of these guys, and when the White House needed a briefing on what's our policy on Laos or on the Icelandic airports, somebody from the Pentagon could immediately go over and deliver a briefing to whoever in the White House was asking for this. So this is a serious inside the Beltway job. So Bob Woodward wasn't some guy who just ambled into Washington and became a national hero. He began his journalistic career already as a security system insider. They're out to get me. My time has expired, so I'd better sit down. I think that was the White House getting back at me. But anyway, I think democracy is on a collision course with innovation and free trade, and it's going to get messy and ugly, and I don't have any solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I will increase the mess. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Alexander and Cormac. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, New Direction and Edmund Burke Institute for hosting us. This is actually my first time attending a New Direction Academy. So, since in this panel we are talking about free trade, free market, innovation, let me start my presentation by reminding us that this year, actually yesterday, September 18, we celebrate the 80 years anniversary of the publication of the famous book, The Road to Serfdom, by the Austrian economic Friedrich von Hayek. Why Hayek wrote this book? Besides being a response to the economist, a British politician, William Beveridge. He wrote this book because in the 1940s, state interventionism was on the rise in Europe as well as in the US. As today, the prevailing belief was in aggressive government intervention in economy, high taxation, and strong and strict regulation. So Hayek reminds us in this book that it became like a Bible for a free market idea, that the loss of economic freedom preceded the loss of intellectual and political freedom. And this is the reason we need to keep pursuing open economy, market competition, to foster economic growth and innovation. So innovation is the main contributor to strong economic growth and technological advancement. Learning to understand the preconditions that lead to innovation demonstrate how different nations and regions around the world excel in innovating breakthrough technology and solutions in different countries, in different industries. To better understand these conditions, it is important to explore the links between free market competition, free trade, and protection of intellectual property rights as the primary drivers of innovation. I will also address the implication of trade policy and regulatory framework between the United States and the European Union and how different approaches could affect the relationship between these two economic giants. The World Bank highlight that trade acts as a catalyst of economic growth by creating better jobs, increasing GDP, and lifting more than 1 billion people out of poverty since 1990. Free trade stimulates innovation by expanding market and enhancing competition. Unfortunately, according to the Trade Barrier Index we start publishing in 2018, to contrast the protectionism at the time by the Trump administration, many governments have introduced new trade restrictions, which despite broad public acceptance in general, often lead to economic inefficiency and reduce civic freedom. For instance, digital trade regulation by the European Union impose stringent content moderation requirements that can stifle freedom of expression and impede the free flow of information. In fact, in this area, Americans and Europeans share the same broad objective, but have markedly different approaches to achieving them. The result is the adoption of an independent policy that either unintentionally damage each other's economy or create misalignment that impede effective economic integration. Despite shared geopolitical interests such as the support of Ukraine or the cautious approach to China, growing divergency in areas like trade, technology, innovation, and climate policy are challenging this relationship. However, the US and the European Union have maintained a strong economic partnership with a bilateral trade totaling an estimate of $1.3 trillion in 2022. With the US presidential election coming in November, regardless who wins the White House, Brussels should brace itself for additional trade friction with the US. Because of this continued divergency in the last 10 years, the European Union-US Trade and Technology Council has been created in 2021 after a year of trade tension. This council was designed basically to bolster cooperation between US and European Union on technological challenges and economic policy. This council tried to emphasize the need to de-risk from China rather than decoupling, at the same time create a unified standard for combating shared challenges. According to Professor Hayek from the Stanford University Cyber Policy Center, if US and the European Union can resolve their tech issues, other countries will follow their lead, given the fact that the US and the European Union together account for 55% of the global information technology market. However, despite the creation of this council, under the Biden administration protectionist policy, the Inflation Reduction Act has exacerbated these trends. While the IRA is aimed at fostering a green industry in the US, it excludes European companies from subsidies, particularly in sectors like electric vehicle production, which rely heavily on specific mineral resources and North American assembly. This has drawn strong criticism from the European Union, and in response, the European Union has introduced its own Green Deal industrial plan in March 2023 that is a huge subsidized economic packages to counteract the Inflation Reduction Act. While the USA has invested in reshoring and boosting high-tech manufacturing, the European Union has increasingly taken a combative stance toward the American tech giant, focusing on punitive measures in the name of digital sovereignty, rather than fostering innovation-friendly regulation. So what is going to happen after the US presidential election and for what concerns trade and innovation? As I mentioned before, under the Biden administration, the US has dramatically expanded its economic security toolkit, building on Trump's era measure to enhance competitiveness against China. This focus on domestic industrial policy economic security is likely to persist under Harris-Walz administration. Despite the Harris criticism to Trump's tariff that she called national sales tax, she completely forgot that she played an important role in advancing the Inflation Reduction Act. She completely forgot that she cast the deciding vote in the spending splurge that drove historic inflation that hit a high 9.1% in 2022. Her administration has imposed almost $1.4 trillion in regulation, and she wants Congress to pass $5 trillion of new taxes over 10 years. Harris also has proposed to raise the top federal capital gains tax rate to 33%. Basically, combining with the capital gain tax in California, 13.3, will lead to a combined tax rate of 46.3, the highest since Jimmy Carter. We need to consider that the capital gain tax in China is 20%, the average in Europe is 17.9%, which will be very detrimental for innovation and for the economy in the US. On the other hand, a second Trump administration would likely pursue a significantly more aggressive trade policy than his first term. He recently announced that he would like to increase 60% tariff on all Chinese product imports, and also 20% of tariff on import from the other trade partner. 10%, if I remember well, on a European Union member. This approach could escalate trade tension and negatively impact global economy relations, including with the European Union. However, if the Republicans will gain the control of the House, the Senate, and the White House in 2025, they may utilize the Congressional Review Act to overturn the Biden administration regulation, in particular, most of the provision of IRA. Republicans, they were able, using the Congressional Review Act, to remove basically 16 Obama regulations when they took power with Trump. So this is an important point that we really hope is going to happen in the future, in a few months. Despite even the recent approach on tariff from the Republican, I want to remind everyone that the Republican Party, since Ronald Reagan, has been philosophically inspired by free trade. Reagan tell us, and I'm quoting him, One of the key factors behind our nation's great prosperity is the open trade policy that allows the American people to freely exchange goods and services with free people around the world. Unfortunately, Trump on this segment on trade broke the Republican dogma on trade. However, on fiscal side, Trump is great. Trump is a great supporter of the supply side economics. In fact, he proposed reducing the corporate tax rate to 15% as a pro-growth measure intended to increase wages, lower household costs, and boosting American manufacturing. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has been signed on December 22, 2017, represent the most important tax reform that has been implemented since 1986 Reagan era. And this because this landmark legislation introduced a huge change in terms of corporate tax. They reduced the corporate tax from 35% to 21%, and now he wants to move to 15%. Because of this tax reform, the World Economic Forum, that is not very friendly to the Republicans in general, they have to admit that America in 2018 and 2018 became the most competitive country in the world because of this tax reform. So, what we need to do in terms of European Union and the US in order to reshape their innovation and trade policy. The European Union has struggled with the technological advancement compared to the United States, particularly in the realm of digital innovation. Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank and the former Prime Minister of Italy, has recently released a report about the future of European competitiveness. And he highlights that the euro productivity gap with the United States largely stems from this failure to capitalize on the digital revolution. Since the mid-90s, Europe has lagged in developing and integrating new digital technology. For instance, think about quantum computing. A forthcoming major innovation is led by Americans and Chinese firms. There is no US-based company in the top ranking. Think about what's happened with Nokia in the 90s. It was leading the mobile market, it's completely disappeared. David Evans, founder and publisher of the Competition Policy International magazine, has criticized Europe's ongoing digital stagnation and is referring to this phenomenon European digital winter. He noted that Europe has not fostered significant digital business comparable to those in the United States, with notable gaps in digital market value despite being a major global economic player. Major European economies like Germany, France, Spain, and Italy have failed to produce high market cap digital business. On the other side, the US trade policy has room for improvement, particularly when we compare to the European Union more extensive network. The US ranked 65 out of 80 countries analyzed on the Trade Barrier Index, holds only 14 trade agreements with 20 countries, while the European Union signed 41 agreements with 72 countries, reflecting more proactive and expansive trade policy. United Kingdom just joined, actually in December 15, will be effective, they joined the Trans-Pacific Agreement. This is a great step forward on expanding market for UK. Just to remember, within the European Union, countries like Netherlands rank number 9, Germany 11, France 27, and Italy 49. United States 65. So there is a lot to make to improve in terms of trade policy. So to conclude, to safeguard the transatlantic relationship in the face of electoral cycle and leadership change, both the US and the European Union must prioritize trade and innovation more than just cooperation on geopolitical crisis. Even if the US and European Union Trade and Technology Council was created in 2021 to play an important role in functioning as a platform to resolve issues related to trade, technology, and innovation, they failed their mission, especially in containing China and especially in building a new agreement. The European Union and the United States should reaffirm their commitment to build a new free market economic order based on 6 key preconditions to foster innovation and, let me say, to achieve the new transatlantic trade investment partnership. That is a shame that there is still not an agreement within the 2 economic giants. These 6 preconditions are economic freedom, low taxation, free trade, government accountability, access to capital, deregulation framework, and a strong protection of intellectual property rights. In my opinion, this is the only way to avoid a falling into a zero-sum game between US and European Union and keep investing on innovation and economic growth. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. We'll open up the floor to questions, I believe. I think Robert has the microphone. Any takers before I pick on someone?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Cormac Lucy. You told about that there is economic tension between the West and China and a little less Russia and Iran, for example. I was wondering in which kind of industries or products do we need to invest, to innovate as the West, to stay ahead or to combat those countries. So what are the priorities the coming years or decades?
Thank you. I think the first priority is not to look at particular industries. I'll come to that in a minute. It is to de-escalate tension. So if as a condition for restoring diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in the early 1970s, the United States recognized that China, including Taiwan, was one entity, I don't see the point of pushing the world to the edge of nuclear war in a fight over Taiwan. I think the West should organize a gradual, and by that I mean over 50, 100 years, transfer of sovereignty of Taiwan to China, and make provision for people in Taiwan to move to the United States or Europe if they don't want to stay in Taiwan under those conditions, and gradually migrate the Taiwanese semiconductor sector and similar strategic sectors to the West within that time frame. Similarly, the war in Ukraine, I just don't understand how that was allowed to happen. Putin is a murdering criminal, but Russia does have strategic interests. The eastern third of Ukraine, the people there are Russian-speaking. So if you look at Northern Ireland, which I'm very familiar with, you had the IRA and the British government in a low-level war that reached a stalemate, where neither was going to be able to knock out the other permanently. And in that scenario, a negotiated peace made sense. And what we have in the east of Ukraine right now is approaching a stalemate. And I think it would make more sense to reach an agreement that would largely center on letting the Russians keep what they've got, or keep those territories where the people, the ethnicity of the residents is Russian, and they opt for Russian sovereignty. So I would say, number one, rather than build defense against Russia and China, try to de-escalate tensions. Number two, in terms of the industries that we need to build up, if you want peace, you need to prepare for war, is the old saying. It's a Latin saying. I don't know the Latin any longer. So I think the West does need to have a vigorous defense capability, but it should build that coupled with a strategic policy where we're hoping we never have to use it. What I worry today is that we've got certainly in Western Europe, a weak defense capability coupled with a strident strategic position. And I think that's a recipe for trouble. If we look at the blowing up of the gas pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline, that illustrates how severely off track public discussion of these issues is in Europe. The notion that the Russians would destroy a pipeline where they've got a control on-off, why would they bother? They can just turn that off whenever they feel like it. So I'm worried that there is a big gap between where political discussion on these issues needs to be and where it is, and the consequence of that gap is that we are permanently at risk of some stupid episode escalating into a modern-day Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that is an enormously important issue. And if President Trump is re-elected, I hope it's something he pays attention to.
If I can push back on that somewhat, Cormac. When I speak to partners in East Asia, they are absolutely livid with us for giving up Hong Kong. Now, I know Hong Kong was a formulation of the Arrow War in the mid-1800s, Treaty of Nanjing, and we did hand it back to the Chinese in the 1990s. The reason they are so angry with us is because that was a little refuge, essentially, of free trade and of innovation. And it's very interesting when you look at, the Hong Kong tax code and how it's changed since the 80s, which was an amazing bit of innovation by Sir John Copperthwaite, who was a British civil servant who went over and just thought, hey, all these free market economists seem to have been saying stuff, let's do it to Hong Kong as a little policy experiment. The HDI, Human Development Index in Hong Kong, skyrocketed, and it embarrassed Beijing. And it also provided a hub for finance for East Asia. Since the handing over of Hong Kong and the recent anti-democratic reforms made by Beijing in Hong Kong, it has essentially acted as a lodestar for further Beijing influence within East Asia. So when I speak to East Asian partners, they go, why did you give it up? It was such a betrayal of democracy and freedom and of innovation and free trade to that extent in East Asia. And my concern is with the de-escalation point you make about Taiwan. The Taiwanese people are rapidly anti-Beijing, and they see themselves. So you make the point of Ukraine, and we'll come on to Alexander to talk a little bit more about that. But the Taiwanese are adamant to maintain sovereignty, and their specialization, you mentioned it in your presentation, is the semiconductor industry. And there are plans, if Beijing invades, to blow up all of TSMC, and the economic damage that would cause to the globe probably it would take 50 to maybe 70 years to recover from. So I think in terms of de-escalation, especially when it comes to dictators, is to tell them we're not messing around, and to get Europe's defence and the West's defence back up and running in order to back up our strategic ambition. So I would disagree somewhat on that. I think the West has an important role to play in leadership for democracy, for free trade, for capitalism, and not giving in to dictators fundamentally. Alex, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's hard to... Are we talking about de-escalation or appeasement?
Well,
appeasement of dictators here. I'm not quite sure I fully understand the strategic interests point. Just because someone says they've got strategic interests somewhere doesn't make their point valid. I could say I've got strategic interests in Siberia. Does that mean I can take Siberia? I don't think the language point is valid. Ireland speaks English, Canada speaks English, Australia speaks English, the US speaks English, most of Africa speaks English. That doesn't mean that England then has a right to then own them. So.
But coming back to the free trade point, which I hope you could touch on.
In regards to Ukraine?
In regards to Ukraine, yes. Do you think there's been a failure of Europe for putting free trade on the table for Ukraine and making sure they are properly integrated within that kind of free trade zone?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
I think there's no point us being democracies if we no longer exist. And the threat of nuclear war is an existential threat to our species. And de-escalating that outranks any other issue. And you can, use a one-word argument, appeasement. It doesn't make a point. The Chinese their geographic goals are limited. We don't know what Putin is up to. Let us hope that the bloody nose he has suffered in Ukraine and his age will restrict him from further adventures. But continuing a war there when the fronts aren't moving, but the death count is rising, I think it would make sense to send in a peace envoy now, shuttle diplomacy and try and just shut that conflict down. Albeit we are supping with the devil. Putin is a devil. But the point is we can't wipe him off the map. So we're going to have to live with him in some form or another. Let's try and live with him in a form that is as cooperative as possible.
I'm going to abuse the fact that I have the microphone to also come in on that with the point that I made during the panel yesterday, which is that this makes a fundamental assumption that, we'll call it the East, actually cares about the sanctity of human life. And when you look at it, we in the West treat every dead Ukrainian as a tragedy. They hold big public burials and big public funerals in Ukraine for every fallen warrior, whereas in the East, in Russia, they're thrown in a cardboard box basically and dumped in a mass grave. And that mentality goes all the way to the top, because frankly the way that the Kremlin thinks about these things is they don't really even think in terms of numbers. They just think in terms of, well, I've got an infinite resource of people that I can keep throwing at the war, and it doesn't matter if they keep going.
If you look at the security measures Putin has in place for his 2 illegitimate children by his current mistress, it is clear that he does not treat all lives as expendable. And he's paying a political price domestically for the failure of his campaign in Ukraine. It's gone into they thought they'd knock Ukraine out within a matter of weeks. That hasn't happened, and that reflects poorly on his leadership and is imposing political costs on him domestically, which is another reason for him to shut this down quickly and declare victory.
Can I just, Max, to you, you talked about the blob, and you described all of the problems that the United Kingdom is facing at a regulatory level, at a planning level. I think anybody who's Irish would have just tick, 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 tick. That we have so many of the same problems, and it may be the case that these are problems that are being replicated in the rest of the Western world, perhaps less in the United States, I don't know. But if it is a blob, and it is a culture which has grown and grown and grown of regulation, which captures, you said, Cormac, the problem is, if, say, in the case of banking, then they start to pursue their own agenda. Well, how do we stop it? How do you unpick it? In a democracy, what is the strategy for cutting the blob open and letting the power leak out? What's the strategy there? How do you
torture them with their own medicine and set up a standalone government department of deregulation, which will essentially regulate them and apply their own medicine to them, but apply economic cost benefit to individual regulations. Like one thing that's extraordinary, my girlfriend works in the public sector. I worked in the public sector. Previously, at the start of my working career, I worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And everybody in PricewaterhouseCoopers has got an hourly charge-out rate. Partners, consultants. So if you were having a meeting of 8 people, you could quickly tot up what's the hourly cost of this meeting given our additive charge-out rates. So this meeting, it's costing €2,000. Is it delivering €2,000 of benefits? So I think politics has to say and decide democratically regulation has gone too far, and then impose a structure that has got a prospect of turning that back in the long term.
I get that, but I suppose my sense, it seems to me politicians have lost confidence in themselves. The politicians have lost confidence in themselves, and they have transferred that, and they have excessive levels of respect for the inverted commas experts outside. And in Ireland, we've seen the transfer of power or responsibility from the Dáil to independent bodies, whether it's Commission Naman or the HSE or whatever. And the minister can say, well, that's not me. That's an independent body. Yes. And it seems to me that that's a democratic deficit, to be cliche, but it's a democratic danger. I don't, Max, if you have thoughts.
So we had this problem in the UK where It all comes down to accountability. This is the big thing. We talk about democracy. Democracy is about accountability. And politicians were so terrified of being held accountable for different policy decisions, they just gave them to quangos, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisations, so the kind of bureaucrats. I mean, the Ministry of Justice in the UK has 36 individual quangos underneath it. 36. There are hundreds. In fact, the first publication the Adam Smith Institute ever published was called Quango, Quango, Quango. It was and we were started in 1977, so this is even pre-Thatcher. The publication, we had to get a special printer to do the publication because it was just a list of all of the quangos in the UK. You'd open up the document, and then you'd unfold the page, and unfold it again, and unfold it again, and unfold it again, and unfold again. The paper was this long of all of the quangos, and we just said, abolish all of them, go through, shopping list, like that. So, Gary, you're right in terms of the loss of confidence. I'm reminded of, it was under Reagan, I can't remember the gentleman exactly who did it, but it was called the Hotel California. So every bill that went through Congress ended up on the president's desk, and it checked into the Hotel California at the top for economic review. And what is it about the Hotel California? You never check out. So it would hold them up, but you require an understanding of statecraft. I think that's the most important thing. Statecraft is important here. And this is the reason why I think Labour in the UK are very interesting. They understand how the state works in the way the Tories never did. And they can utilise the power of the state to execute their will. When Keir Starmer first came in, he appointed a lot of his favourite people, mainly from the Tony Blair Institute, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and the Resolution Foundation, into top government roles because they had the policy ideas and they would execute them through, and they will execute them through using the state and the power of the state, which is now very large. The right have always failed to do that, either from a lack of confidence in themselves and their ideology, but also of the ideology of limiting the state. And if you can limit the state and the power of politicians, you just hand it off. And that's been a really big folly and something that obviously we saw the Tories punished for in the last election. So I think it is incumbent upon those on the centre-right, those who are classical liberals, to utilise the power of the state, much to what Cormac was saying, to limit the power of the state. And I think that's how you solve these things. You have to be brave, and firstly you have to get back into power to do it. And you have to be brave in being accountable to the public and to journalists as well. Any other thoughts on that, Lorenzo, perhaps?
No, I agree most of you. I mean, going back to the point of the how to contain a situation like Ukraine or Taiwan, I think I'm not expert in defense, but we need to, United States and Europe fail since the end of the Cold War to think about the deterrence. So this situation in Ukraine and Taiwan is happening because we lost the idea of a deterrence strategy that completely was successful during the Reagan administration, for example, or even Nixon during the Cold War. So to contain dictator, criminal like Putin, we need to rethink about how the United States and Europe need to rebuild, especially the European Union, a defense strategy. Mm-hmm. Because if Ukraine happened, because in the NATO, we were in the lowest point. So this allowed Putin to move on. I think there was a lack of strategy from his side because at the end of the day, NATO gained 2 countries, Finland and Sweden. So he has more NATO neighbor now than before. But we failed because we should prevent this war completely. Pay more attention what's going on in 2014 in Donbass, what's happening in Crimea. So this is my comment.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, here. Oh. Still 10 minutes, I think, Robert. Or are we out of time? Almost out of time. Last question.
We could lose 2 of the minutes here.
I've recently read that I think 134 countries applied to join the Brics, which can be seen as an alternative for the G7 countries. They focus on the free trade or trade agreements, financial system, and My question was for Cormac and Alexander. Do you think that such an alternative system can coexist peacefully next to, let's say, the Western economic unions, etc.? Or do you think that it will threaten our economic and free trade position in the long term, or maybe even leads to violence in the future?
Well, can it exist peacefully? I'm sure it can. I think the challenge such an organisation is going to have is there's going to be a conflict between the extent of its membership and its coherence. And the more members it has, the harder it will be for it to be focused on a limited number of achievable goals. And one of the advantages of the EU was that it started off with 6 countries that had very clearly agreed goals. But you know, the European Economic Community still had difficulties achieving those goals. So if you're trying to gather 100 countries under one umbrella, it's going to be very difficult to keep them all on the one agenda. So I'm not sure if it's going to be a serious threat to the West because of that challenge, the challenge of keeping coherence coupled with a very, very... Look at the United Nations. What does it achieve in practical terms? It has everybody in it, but everybody has different viewpoints, and it's very hard for it to agree on anything.
Yeah, I think with Brics as well, it's the goals of it. As you said, there's not a great deal of coherence between the members. It is a bit of a hodgepodge group put together, I feel, to some degree, to show they can be put together, to show the West, oh look, we can do our own thing. But I don't really see where it's going. I think what's actually more interesting is more regional trade groups like the African Continental Free Trade Area that's slowly and surely going into place. That's a continent-wide free trade area with most of the nations already ratified, about 46 of the 55 who have signed on. I think that's far more interesting and likely to have a longer, much longer life than Brics would. But I feel Brics will always kind of keep going despite not really doing much.
And who are the big African countries that have not yet signed up to the African Free Trade bloc?
They've all signed up.
All right, okay, great.
All South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, all on. The only ones who haven't signed it to just say they're supportive is Eritrea.
Okay.
But that's often known as the North Korea of Africa, the Hermit Kingdom. And all the big ones have now ratified it, but it's just the case of if they can get all the policies in place and actually legislate it, and that's going to take a while. But at least it shows, actually, it's quite important. So the main question I often get about the FCFTA is, what makes you think it's successful? And there's a few reasons: more countries already involved, etc. It's been going on a while. But even if it's not successful, I think it's beneficial because it shows at least African leaders are wanting to move in a free trade direction. Compare that to, so the free trade area in Africa has been put in place by the African Union. The predecessor to the African Union was the Organization of African Unity. And that was founded essentially on socialist principles for a kind of socialist ideas were a necessity to form an African personality. That's what the founder said in 1963. Whereas today you've got leaders, even if you don't trust them at their word, still pushing free trade, and that's actually maybe a very optimistic note to end on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to my panel, and thank you all for listening. I'll see you back here at 11:30 for the New Virtue Economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've already solved many issues. We've resolved, absolutely the migration crisis, the demographic collapse, the challenges to free speech. It's been a very productive few days, if you think of it. However, we have yet to overcome the impossible, which is to reconcile, or try to do so, economic liberalism, broadly speaking, to traditional or conservative values. On Monday, I referred to how modern conservatism in the Anglo-Saxon tradition seems to me to share a fairly similar meaning of liberty to that of liberalism, classical liberalism in particular. It is not necessarily bad, but I pointed out that the fact that this is the case seemed to be highly problematic insofar as such a definition was relatively stuck in a negative dimension, as absence of coercion, of government intervention, as freedom from, in essence. A notion of freedom that seems today unable to provide a definition of common goods or any guidance or little guidance regarding identity. Now, as the latter is under siege in light of so many different fronts, such as mass migration, for instance, certain topics we've discussed over these past few days, conservatives across the West are increasingly seeking a more positive meaning of liberty, not just freedom from, but above all, freedom to, which enables them to come up with a definition of the good life and stick to it. Now, because of that, conservatives are also facing a growing, I would say, temptation to not only access power and institutions as they should, but also to capture them, for lack of a better word, and direct them in the pursuit of the notion of the common good. Now, this leads conservatism into a crossroads where there is a clear tension, a growing tension, between liberty and authority, as I said on Monday, a tension that is especially present, I suppose, in economics, where conservatives are increasingly adopting statist policies, and free market capitalism is going out the window because it faces challenges both to the left and now right. As a result, I believe it's worth asking ourselves a few questions, which I hope can motivate an exciting discussion, especially in this already small get-together, during this panel and perhaps over lunch. Now, the first question that we should not overlook is obvious before we jump into today's title, Virtue Economics, which is, should we care about free markets at all? And if so, why? I would make the case that there are intrinsic reasons to say that we should care indeed about free markets. I think there is a moral case for morality economics. Free is better than unfree. There is also an instrumental case for morality in economics. First, because free market capitalism works. That's why conservative politicians like Reagan and Thatcher champion them. It allows also for big tent conservatism, I think, from classical liberalism to the outer layers of the so-called new right. However, over the past decade and a half, perhaps since the 2008 Great Recession, free markets are thought to have failed on a number of issues. They have failed to fulfill its communitarian purposes. They may have served the community in general, on average, but not every member of society, so that some people have been left behind. There has been a growing market concentration in many countries, which has also led to regulatory capture and crony capitalism. The emergence of competing superpowers in the international landscape that break the rules of the game when it comes to free trade, for instance, have also posed the question of whether we can have both free markets domestically and free trade internationally. So in light of all of this, I believe both classical liberals and conservatives must do their best to arrive to a common understanding. I guess free marketeers must strive not only to a free but also to a virtuous society, and conservatives must realize of the danger, both moral and material, of statism. This is where the school of economic thought, New Virtue Economics, comes in, as a fusion of traditional or conservative values with economic liberalism, a school that examines how free market how free markets, can promote not only individual wealth, but collective well-being. That shows how free markets need not lead to moral decay, but can actually sustain traditional values. As Professor McCloskey puts it, capitalism can be virtuous if it's embedded in a culture of virtue, practices like prudence, justice, temperance, and love. Michael Novak goes a step further, I think, arguing that capitalism can only work, not only be moral, but can just work under a virtuous society. According to Novak, a free economy is morally sustainable only if it is embedded in a culture of virtue, without self-restraint, discipline, and public-spiritedness. Freedom degenerates into license. Now, this account of economic liberalism is not new. In 1960, in the Humane Economy, Röpke argued that the market must be free, but man must be governed by a moral law higher than that of the market. Hayek, to whom Lorenzo just mentioned, thought of free markets in a similar fashion. And a century before these two, Lord Acton also wrote at great length about the importance of a free but virtuous society. Now, we find ourselves in a similar pickle, but perhaps our need is to reach a swift and favorable agreement on this more rapidly, as classical liberals find themselves, as I just said, surrounded by statists to the left and right. So let us begin the discussion here. Can free markets be reconciled with conservative thoughts, or is it just impossible or too confusing? After all, ideological tribalism is indeed diverse and complex, as are their intellectual forefathers. McCloskey, for instance, has described herself as a literary, quantitative, postmodern, free market, progressive, Episcopalian, Midwestern woman from Boston who was once a man. After all, she was born Donald and lived as a man until age 53. So there's that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Very good. Now, when it comes to citing great men and women, great thinkers around liberalism and philosophy, there's someone you missed out, Juan. It's Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in his best book, it's a very controversial statement for the Director of Research and Education at the Adam Smith Institute, say, is the theory of moral sentiments. It is, in my opinion, that the theory of moral sentiments is a much more inclusive work, because he does touch a little bit on economics, a little bit on religion, quite a lot on society, and a great deal on psychology. And it was Adam Smith's most interesting insights. It's around the idea of sympathy with your fellow man, fellow woman. And I think that itself embodies the very nature of capitalism that we enjoy today. It is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, one cannot barter or trade if they cannot see why the other person wants their good or service. Now, it is a very good point there, and I think virtue is very much part of that empathy and that sympathy. However, I'm going to attack the motion, if I may, from a left perspective and what we already see as the new virtue economy. That is the idea of selling or forcing virtue. How one would want to describe that usually is from the person who's enforcing it, and placing it down upon free economies and free people. The great proponents of this are people like Jeffrey Sachs, Larry Fink at BlackRock. It's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are great proponents of this new virtue economy, because to them it seems that there are cracks and problems within societies and cultures that can only be fixed by forcing changes to economic systems. I speak here of stakeholder capitalism, not shareholder capitalism. And one of my big concerns with this, with pushing forward the idea of virtue economics, is that, as Juan has mentioned already, it is already quite apparent that capitalism is a virtuous thing. It is of immense success. You can prove it empirically. You could even prove it deontologically, as Ayn Rand does. But I think if in the wrong hands, the left will really take it and run. And the reason why I say that is from experience. The Conservative government in the UK, for example, decided to have the wonderful idea of banning smoking. Now that was seen as and by the way of doing that, it was to do generational age ban. So if you're born on January 1st, 2009 or later, you will never legally be allowed to buy a tobacco product in the United Kingdom again. Now that is seen as very virtuous by our public health gods. You know, Lord Bethel, who's a Conservative peer, saw this as one of the greatest strides of public health, basically since we banned indoor smoking. And for him, it was virtuous in order to secure both the National Health Service, which is seen by itself as a golden calf, which you cannot criticise, but also to secure a productive, healthy society and economy, which, you know, which does not have vice. It is pure Puritanism, it's puritanical. Now, as we know, Rishi Sunak was thrown from number 10 and half his party in July, and it's been picked up again by Labour, who are now going to move towards the ban on smoking. For them, it is even more virtuous to control public health. It is even more virtuous to control individual liberty. It is even more virtuous to control economic activity undertaken freely. And that is my concern with this motion, essentially, is that I think in order to reconcile economic liberalism and conservative values, you open up a really nasty area that could be infiltrated and used to smash on the heads of a free society. You know, the virtues of the left. And I think that is my big concern with this. And it's already started in many ways on the economics side. A question for the audience: who here has heard of B Corp? Few different people have heard of B Corp. B Corp is in the business of selling virtue. Now, what could be more capitalist than selling virtue? It's fantastic. However, whenever you look at a lot of the big products you see nowadays, well, Coca-Cola may not do it, but a lot of high-value consumer goods, they bring in B Corp to look at the structure of the company and make it more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive, to help reach those UN sustainability goals. And when you review those companies, not much has changed at all, but they keep on pushing. There was a report done, they paid Demos, another think tank in the UK, to really show that a more virtuous company, one which really does integrate EDI and stakeholder capitalism into its structure, performs better. Now, I reviewed this work. What they did is they took all of the portfolio companies of B Corp and they compared it against a hypothetical company. The workings for this I was never able to discover for some reason. And they showed, of course, you know, the ethical, virtuous company performs much more, in a much better fashion. It pays its workers better. It allows its employees to sit on the board of the company. It's got total integration up and down, a very horizontal leadership structure, etc. They perform much better, and this is how we should move. Just so happens that that paper ended up in the hands of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party are rumoured to be wanting to change the Companies Act in the UK to move towards that kind of system. So we move from a system which is of the joint stock company, of shareholder capitalism, and by force of government, by fiat, move it through to this stakeholder capitalism, this virtuous capitalism. And that, for me, is that big concern, because it is utilising the power of the state to enforce this ideology on the free economy. And we can show that these companies don't work as well, and yet because policymakers are so convinced by the virtues of this new type of company, we will end up in a better place as a country, as a society, and as an economy. So that is my criticism of this. Now, that isn't totally to say I'm not against including, you know, virtue in capitalism. It should be mentioned and it should be reconciled. Deirdre McCloskey, of course, who's the great proponent of this, writes in her Bourgeois Virtues, her Virtue series, explaining how capitalism came to be generated over that, you know, period from the 1400s to the 1700s, and explains it through a cultural aspect, you know, and a very Christian aspect, Judeo-Christian. And I think there is a lot of merit within that work. She does need an editor, God bless her, because she does repeat, you know, the thesis quite a lot. And they are wonderful to read. But I think it's worthy as an academic text. I just don't think it should be included in such a forthright manner into the current discussions we have around economics, especially when the challenge is people are not listening to us who are in power. And I don't believe that including those Christian values is going to change their mind, to be quite honest. So the question then remains, how do we bring our, you know, I'm a neoliberal, classical liberal, however you want to frame it. How do we bring our conservative partners on board? And I think the answer to that is to show them that it works. And it works well in Christian societies. And it works well in societies that value the rule of law and freedom of speech, and those conservative and liberal values where we already are fused. I think it is continuing to bang the drum for, for the merits and evidence that free market capitalism works. And hopefully they come alongside. And when they push back, they say, oh, well, it may damage the interests here of our country because, we've closed down our manufacturing sector or whatever else. We have to be more lucid and we have to be more convincing in our arguments. I don't think we need to change the foundational idea itself. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to discussing it with the other panelists and you. Thank you.
Just had to do one more quick note. Well, I have two goals today. The first one is to provoke you, every one of you, for one simple reason. I want a good exchange afterwards, a good discussion, a heated one, if possible. So please, let yourself be provoked. I love that. And the second one is, hopefully I succeed with that, to show you a new perspective, especially on virtues, because I think that in many, many cases, virtues nowadays are seen as these kinds of self-sacrificial, self-harm principles, and I think they don't have to be, first of all, and second of all, they shouldn't be, because if they are, in my opinion, they are not virtues, but anti-virtues. So let me start on a basis of an economist that was already mentioned, Deirdre McCloskey. And Deirdre mentions 7 virtues in her work. The first one being prudence, second one temperance, then justice, courage, love, faith, and hope. And I will go over each one of them and just reinterpret them, because I think, unfortunately, I have to do some violence to Deirdre's work, which I respect immensely, I have to say, but still I think there's too much self-harm still in there. And what I want to do is to reinterpret these virtues in a way that embody strengths, embody self-interest. So let me start with prudence. What is prudence? Well, prudence is nothing more than the ability of foresight, of strategic thinking, of rational calculation on how to best advance one's self-interest. So note that self-interest shouldn't be understood in a materialistic way. It should be more understood in an emotional way, meaning that you try to advance a good feeling, a good emotion, and trying to avoid some bad feeling, bad emotions. And that's all subjective, of course. There's not really an objective element in that. And some people find it problematic. I don't really find it problematic, I have to say. So yeah, prudence is a means of improving one's situation over time. What does this mean in the context of the market? Well, it just means that prudence leads to better decisions over time, not just because people are doing that anyway, but because the market provides a feedback on who makes good decisions, and people are seeing that and are trying to adopt these strategies that the persons who are successful are using and make better decisions in the future as well. So they are learning and imitating successful strategies, which is why this virtue is very important. Then the next one is temperance, and temperance is just a moderating force. It creates a control that is necessary to prevent some impulsive desires from dictating behavior. And what that means in the market context, of course, is that there's a much longer term perspective coming out of that. So not just short-term perspective like politicians often have, but a longer term perspective, maybe even spanning generations if you have families. And again, of course, because of the market provides feedback, it also creates some feedback that incentivizes people to have a longer term perspective. Then let's talk about justice. And justice is a tricky one to reinterpret from a purely strength and self-interest perspective. I'm still trying it, but I have to say, I myself am not completely convinced by it. That's just a warning. But, what do we need justice for? It is for establishing trust, for cooperation, for social order, essentially. And the virtue of justice is essentially just to inform or transform prevailing notions of justice within a society. What is justice in my opinion? In my opinion, justice is just giving people what they deserve. What do people deserve? Well, that highlights a very interesting point regarding rights, because I think rights ought not be handed down or handed out by the virtue of existence. They should be deserved, they should be earned. And why is this crucially important? Because something you earned, something you worked for, is valued much more. This, for example, is why I think that freedom is in retreat. People don't value it anymore because they don't have to work for it. Give people the need to work for their rights, and they value their rights much, much more. And essentially, if they have to work for rights, this leads to a meritocratic system which essentially has people compete for what they think they deserve. And again, if they fail to get what they think they deserve, they have to adopt other strategies. So that's perfectly good in my opinion. Then we have courage. Courage, in my opinion, is just a force that thrives in the face of uncertainty and of challenge. And it's the ability to confront the unknown, to embrace uncertainty, to embrace risks, and to assert oneself. Yeah, this leads to much more innovation, that leads to much more change, and it can, of course, lead to very high rewards, not only in the material sense, but also in an emotional sense, because you can see how your vision of the world or of a society or of a product even just if it's a product, you can see your vision being created in the world. You aren't just passive, you are an active influence in the world. You shape the world, so to speak. Then there's love. And love can be understood as a kind of relational strength. But this doesn't just go into romantic love. It goes also, what is meant is also the bonds we share with family, with friends, with community. And the person whom we love, I think we are genuinely interested in making that person stronger, better, more capable, not holding them down, diminishing them, exploiting them. So if somebody loves somebody, I think that this creates a deep understanding of what this person needs. And what do we need in the market to create a good product? We need to know what the people need. We just need that information. So if you love other people, you are automatically better in the market as you know what people need. And again, the feedback mechanism works in exactly the same way as in the other areas as well. Yeah, then let's go to hope. Hope, it pushes individuals to just pursue growth and innovation and take action even in the face of adversity, to invest in long-term goals, to overcome obstacles. It fuels creativity, it creates a desire for innovation, and it makes it essential to personal and to societal progress. Because it just pushes boundaries, it creates values, and therefore it creates innovation. And again, if you create innovation, you will get rewarded by the market if the innovation is successful. And you already know the feedback mechanism of the market reinforces that virtue. And lastly, we have faith. Faith, I would say, is a form of both mental and relational strength, for the simple reason that it has two aspects. The first one is the faith in oneself, and the second one is the faith in others. The faith in oneself is rooted in self-reliance, in a sense or belief in one's power to shape one's environment. And faith in others, that relies on strength in other people, in character strength, essentially, so I can trust them. If there's no strength in character, if people are just weak, you can't really trust them, because they will probably betray you in some way or the other. So, in individuals that trust themselves, that have faith in themselves, are much more likely to take some entrepreneurial risks, and faith in others, that allows for long-term relations, business relations, alliances, contracts, stuff like that. So the market just rewards people who have faith in themselves and in other people, but the important thing is the market only rewards people who have faith in people in a non-naive way. Because if you trust people, if you have faith in people naively, the market will probably not reward you that much. So that's something to keep in mind. So what I want to argue now is that I think there are just 4 virtues that are necessary for a functioning free market. And these are strength, authenticity, overcoming, and life affirmation. What do I mean with strength? Sorry, I need some water, I guess, but no water here. Thank you. Well, what is strength? Strength is just these virtues that I have just mentioned. These I would all subsume. Thank you. These I would all subsume under strength. So. Perfect. Okay, then we have authenticity, and authenticity is just living in accordance to one's true selves, to one's true values, to one's desires, rather than conforming to outside pressures. So it's what Thoreau would have called following the beat of your own drummer. That's what authenticity is. It's about embracing our differences and individuality. It creates specialization, and as you probably know, specialization is one of the core it is essentially the core of social cooperation, at least if you follow Mises. And it's also, it creates some differentiation and new and more nuanced and specialized offers on the market. And again, this is rewarded in many cases, which creates a feedback and incentive for people to follow suit, to be authentic. Then we have overcoming. Overcoming, this relates to a crucial misunderstanding, in my opinion, that even most economists live by, namely that the market is something stationary and should be analyzed in that way, you know, the whole balancing models with the break-even points and stuff like that. I would argue that the market is something quite the contrary. The market is a constant process of becoming, of change. It is constant creative destruction, disruption, and transformation going on. This is a process that often hurts, that is always challenging in some ways, and yet it is nothing more than the principle of evolution applied to society. Because people are constantly adapting their behavior in response to the situation that they are in now. They are sowing the seeds of further disruption, of a furtherance of this process. So this process can't really be stopped. And then we have life affirmation. And life affirmation is just saying a wholehearted yes to life, including all sufferance, all chaos, all imperfection. It cultivates a positive, a growth-oriented mindset, and this increases the willingness to undertake some entrepreneurial ventures. So it also creates some perseverance despite setbacks. So this is something that is also very much valued in the market. So these are my 4 virtues, I would argue. This is strength, authenticity, overcoming, and life affirmation. To conclude, let's ask ourselves whether we in Europe are embracing these virtues. Do we value and celebrate strength? Well, I don't think so, unfortunately. In many ways, we are celebrating weakness. We are subsidizing behavior that is a consequence of this weakness, and thereby creating incentives to be weak. The whole victim culture, for example, is just one of the more obvious symptoms of this problem. I think that one of the reasons for the lack of strength in society, I have already mentioned. This is that people don't have to work for their rights anymore. They don't have to deserve something. They just expect to get things. Then, are we living in society in a society where people dare to be authentic? And unfortunately, again, I don't really think so. Most people just follow the herd and don't speak their mind for the simple reason that they don't want to get any problems. Because nowadays, if you speak your mind, you probably will get cancelled. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that I love to speak to conservatives, because I've never in my life heard from a conservative, I dislike your opinion and you should be cancelled. I didn't hear that from a conservative. So thank you for that, and please keep it that way. That's important. But yeah, back to speaking one's mind. If people don't even do that, how much less likely is it that they act in an authentic way? I think the chances are next to none. Are we embracing overcoming? Well, just look at all the bureaucratic structures and regulation that is going on. I can't really, in my opinion, it can't really be argued that we really embrace overcoming. It's about holding people back and trying to stop disruption from happening. So, no, overcoming is also not a virtue we embrace. And lastly, is our society life-affirming? I'll leave that to judge for yourself, but just 2 words to help you out there. Last generation. I don't think there's too much life affirming in there. I think, to conclude, we lost the fight on the virtues that really matter for a free society, for a free market. And that is why a free market currently only operates on the fringes, at the fringes of society. Like, for example, the crypto economy is a very good example of that. In these societies, in these areas, in these fringes, there are still people who embrace these virtues of strength, of authenticity, of overcoming, and of life affirmation, and they are fleeing to these areas for good reason. So if we want to enlarge the scope of the free market again, we have to fight for the right virtues, and we have to win this fight. Thank you.
Should we take some questions?
It's on now, I think. Good. I enjoyed the presentations very much, and I particularly just want to concentrate on Maxwell's, because he raised this question of the moves against shareholder capitalism, which I think is a very crucial one, and which I think is a matter of one virtue, namely justice, and others. The justice one is, of course, the shareholder capitalism is based upon the idea it is the investors who take the risks. They pay, the banks have a rate of return guaranteed, the workers bargain with their employers for a guaranteed income, and what's left goes to the shareholders. And that's just because they're the people who founded it and they're taking the risks. If you introduce a system in which the stakeholders, and of course it seems to me the concept of stakeholder is like a concertina. It can be expanded or contracted according to taste. That means that the people who are already paid or who are getting their interest will be determining what the shareholders are allowed to keep. I doubt if that is just at all, and I certainly think it is a disincentive to capital investment. Who will benefit from this? Well, obviously, I'm afraid this is another example of the relentless march of the managerial revolution. The managers could go to the banks now, borrow the money, and buy their shareholders out. Why don't they do that? Because they don't want to assume the risks. But what they want to do is to spend the surplus capital, the profits, on their tastes and their interests. Those tastes and interests have often been dictated by people outside the company, like the wife of the CEO, who wants money to go to some favorite charity or cultural event. I think the second, but now a more sinister element is coming into this. Government and its allies in the corporation want to take the shareholders' profits and give them to favored political and social causes. I think that is wrong, and I think if the managers want to do that, they should first buy the company, and then secondly, they can distribute the rewards of the enterprise at will. I think these things are bad. I'm not sure also how the concept, how the stakeholder concept would encourage what we would all like to see, innovation and the growth of the owner enterprises. That is the source, as we know from Elon Musk, of enormous advantages to society, in that these are the people who really make, not solely, but they make a lot of the major innovations. Secondly, they are a force within society for non-establishment points of view, and for the points of view that are not necessarily emerging from the large collectivities in society. And that itself is a virtue. I think I could go on for some time now, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll come, as soon as you address me on this, I'll come back on this. What's very concerning, we're seeing this in the UK at the moment, is this idea of stakeholder capitalism is now being included in law. For those of you who aren't aware, there was a judgment in the High Court a couple of weeks ago with the retailer Next. And it was a paid discrimination suit, actually, because the till workers in Next were upset that the people in the warehouses were being paid more. Now, I don't know if anyone has ever worked in a warehouse. I haven't, but I've read enough testimony to say it's pretty back-breaking labour. And it's seeing as my sister used to work in a shop, used to talk to her about it, a little bit more relaxed and sedentary. So the input was different, the demand is different. Shop workers didn't want to go and work in the warehouse because they preferred that, that style of work, and they were paid less for it. They sued Next. The High Court came out and said, this is wrong, they should be paid exactly the same. This is the stakeholder capitalism that we're talking about here. It is people feeling entitled essentially to the fruits of others' labour, whether that's within the company structure or even in their interactions with policymakers. We're seeing all these calls for new taxation as well of corporates, and we're about to see capital gains tax go to the highest rate in Europe. So it's a part of a mindset. It's part of this left, statist virtue that is being kind of woven into the fabric of capitalism at the moment. It's very concerning. And John, you're also right to talk about innovation being held back. Now, if a company is willing to, differentiate itself on the marketplace by being, by having a very flat company structure, by paying all of its workers, equally sourcing its coffee from certain places, you're aware of the arguments, they are at liberty to do so. The problem is that other companies, let's say Tesla or SpaceX even, who would have thought 30 years ago that we'd be landing rockets in the middle of the ocean by themselves, right? If they're going to sell on the technological innovation, which we know is better for resource control, it's better for the world, it's better for capitalism, and for, as Martin was saying, the life affirmation point, I think it's pretty cool to see rockets landing by themselves, for example. If you choose to divert resources by force away from innovation and R&D and into this stakeholderism, you are going to hold your economies back, and we will all be worse off for it in the medium to long run.
I'd like to say just a few words on this exchange. So I think we should distinguish. So what you've just described is not strictly speaking stakeholder capitalism. I would distinguish between, so what you described, John, on distributing profits and also expanding the decision-making process, ownership of the company, that's not stakeholder capitalism, that's communism, right? Yes, so stakeholder capitalism, strictly speaking, I'm not that sympathetic with it, but it comes from a more benign view on things, which is that the company should be aware of its surroundings, so to speak, which has always been the case. That's why when I hear social capitalism, to me it's redundant, because capitalism has always been social. I just came from Florence, so the Medici were very much aware of their surroundings, not to get killed for once, but also to make money. So to put some popes in Rome, to come from the spice trade to banking, so they knew this and they were praised for it, to support, to be patronage of the arts, etc. So they knew of this. So in that sense, from a company to see, to be aware of its surroundings and to have an impact in society, I think that's good. That's good for the company. That's good for society. What I would be against is to have it mandated from the states, from government, for that to become a license to operate in the market.
I'm sorry, you are allowed to ask a question in a moment. Just regarding stakeholder capitalism, I think one very interesting point is that in stakeholder capitalism, people are just completely missing the point of unintended consequences. Let me go into one extreme example of this. I guess we all agree that child labor is bad, right? you are probably not saying that child labor is good. Well, if a company now says that they will abolish child labor and everyone has to agree with that, and there should be no work for children anywhere, well, what are the consequences of that? The reason the children are working in some countries is not that they have bad parents, that the parents are just exploiting their children. That's not the point. The point is that this is a decision between either the children are working in that countries or they are starving. Now, what is what comes good out of that if companies are saying, no, we don't want any child labor anymore? There's nothing good coming out of that. Companies that are trying to help children should focus on giving them better opportunities, not taking the one opportunity that they value most, the children and the parents of the children, that is, away from them. That is counterproductive. And this applies to most of what's happening in stakeholder capitalism, in my opinion.
Just to very quickly build on that point, my favorite example of this is South Korea. In the 1950s, well, literally from late 1800s through to about the 1970s, child labor was rampant in South Korea. And does anyone here think child labor is still rampant in South Korea? No, it's one of the most developed, advanced economies in the world. And it's because, and Martin's completely correct on this, Western companies at that time were happy to use child labor. You know, the parents were in the fields, backbreaking labor, growing rice and cabbage and all sorts of stuff. The children were many times in the factories, and then they would divert extra time to education, to quote one Charles Anthony Linton Blair. And I think what's really horrifying from the West perspective on this is child labor was common, even in the early 1900s, up until, the 1930s onwards. And at that point it stopped. And now it's seen as sort of a savage thing to do, to have child labor. It would be in a developed economy, but a lot of the world is not yet developed. And I think we need to have a more sober view of this. And I think this is one of the very damaging things about this stakeholder capitalism, which is, seeking to enforce Western values and Western prejudices onto economies and countries which are just not at that point of having them.
Said better than I ever could.
All right, thanks, guys. It looks like I have a bit of a tough act to follow with that question, but I'll try my best. We've been talking about a lot of the internal issues with this new kind of virtue economics, but what about for a perfectly liberal economic state? What about the external threats? So I'm thinking of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's climate club he started last year as an example, where he's basically trying to get as many countries together as possible to all agree to impose massive tariffs on certain imports unless certain steps have been taken to make sure they're green. So basically you have a bunch of mostly Western countries getting together to force companies in external markets to obey their sense of what is virtuous or lose access to those markets. And we also see some of that from China as well, in the sense of it will put pressure on companies to obey certain values in terms of certain political situations. I won't go into detail, or potentially lose access to that market. How should states respond? How should companies respond? What do you guys think of this problem?
Well, the main problem again is the problem of unintended consequences. If you do that, you make the countries that are most affected poorer. We already see that, by the way, in some cases, and there's an even more damaging regulation coming out of Europe, that is the supply chain regulation, I think it's called, where every company has to make sure that all things that they have in their supply chains have to be ethically produced, things like that. And yeah, if you do that, of course, the most affected will be the poorest people in the world. So how should countries react to that? Well, get rid of that regulation. It's extremely damaging, and politicians don't really get what damage they are doing with that. They don't get it, but they have to. And I think companies should just show vivid examples of what that regulation is doing. Like, for example, taking the workplaces of people that are amongst the poorest in the world because the company can't produce in that country anymore. Things like that. Do that.
This is a case in the UK at the moment. I wrote a paper on this last year. It's called the Social Value Act. Now, any UK people who are familiar with UK legislation probably have never heard of this. It started as a backbench bill that got government support in the coalition years. And what it mandates is that the government supply chain for procurement has to include social value. Now, I challenge anyone to tell me what that is, and secondly, tell me how you measure it. Because I spoke to government officials and they couldn't tell me. I even asked MPs who voted for it, who then forgot about voting for it, and then couldn't tell me about it either. This is now fully within every single supply chain of government procurement, including our nuclear deterrent, Trident. So now Trident needs to undertake social value work, which includes, for example, there's about 30 pages of regulations you have to follow, and then you have to mark your own homework and say you've done it. So very strange. It includes stuff like how much time are you spending volunteering in the local community to promote green issues? How much time are you spending in the local community to combat modern slavery? Now, also, is your data center secure? Do you have your own data center? And your homework's marked against that. Now, my dad procures to the government. Him and his best mate started a little company called Health 2 Works. Other retailers are, of course, available. And it's two guys in an office coding stuff for the National Health Service in order for their IT systems to work. He has to fill out the same form as Fujitsu, one of a global procurement partner, who has an entire department of 250 people to do social value work. That is unfair, and that it is causing serious headaches amongst micro, small, and medium-sized businesses to compete against large companies. The larger companies have entire websites, microsites devoted towards their social value work. If you're a small business, you don't have the time, you don't have the resources, and you're phased out of the procurement process. And coming straight back to John's point, does this affect innovation? Yes, it does, because if we believe in creative destruction and market forces, if you cannot participate in that economy because of regulation which is completely, not to do with the work you do or the service you provide, you're going to stop innovation. It's one of those pernicious acts that's currently on the books, and again, most politicians have never heard of it. Juan.
Nothing to add to that.
I have a question. I know this is probably a bit weird, maybe more of an outside view, but listening to you guys was quite enlightening, let's say, just see what people think in terms of politics, something I just dabbled into from the outside, let's say. And my question to Maxwell, do you think there could be any other use of integrating religious aspects that can impact economics? You said to just sort of, I hope it's not too inflammatory. What I mean by that is, from the beginning, I can't remember who mentions the two basic axioms of conservatism. Culture is upstream from politics and religion is upstream from culture. And for the past few days, I was struggling to understand what does that really mean. And to my understanding, it feels like politics is what's meant to help us interact at, let's say, a physical level. Culture helps us interact at let's say, a psychological level from our heritage and all the things we have there that make us who we are. And religion, in a sense, is meant to encapsulate what's real beyond what we can see. And in the spiritual sort of arena, which is I don't think there's any sort of law or culture that can really stifle what the spiritual reality, the effect it can have, So I don't know, maybe that's a bit beyond whatever we were talking here, but I thought, especially talking about virtues, since our culture is rooted in Christianity, and the guys who founded it, the virtues they were talking about, actually, if I can quote Galatians 2:5-22, it says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. it's probably beyond politics, but the idea is that somebody who has the fear of God in them and this practice, the relationship with God, the Spirit of God comes inside of them, and these things just emanate. It's like a fruit, something that comes out of them. At a personal level, our interactions would reflect that. And then I think, I don't know, it's just a crazy idea. If there were like Spirit-filled people in politics, this would emanate in economics and society in every other aspect. I don't know if you're familiar with revivals in England, maybe 200 years ago. They radically changed society for a certain amount of time. So back to my question is, how do you think, because you're mentioning that some people were mentioning something about religion to integrate in policy, and you were saying to kind of do away with it just because it might not fit. But I guess the way I see virtues portrayed, they don't really have anything to do with the spiritual aspect, but maybe just some definitions that we're trying to just box ourselves in, you know, in order to appear virtuous. But in reality, the essence is inside, you know. So how do you think that can be integrated in economics, let's say?
It's an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. It depends, firstly, whose virtues you want, right? So Aristotle wrote the Nicomachean Ethics. You know, I think it was 7 different virtues. John may correct me on this, but you know, and that actually proliferated throughout the ancient economies, because in many ways the economy is just the outward-facing interactions of individuals in society who do already embody those values. Now, you asked about, you know, will there be, you know, very religious, spiritual people at the top of society and the top of economies? Look at America. America is a very religious society with very religious connotations. You know, it is constitutionally an atheistic state, an atheistic republic, and yet they still have on their bills, God bless the United States. You know, it's still very much. And when I speak to conservatives in America, they're very religious, including the business people, and they really see what they're doing with their enterprises, with their work ethic, as evocations and celebrations of God. Right, so it's already there. My concern was more, you know, these more humanistic values that the state can use. I'm reminded of Marx on this one, right? Marx saw religion as the opiate of the masses. Now, I'm a nicotine user. I think religion can be the nicotine of the masses. I mean, it's a real, you know, it can help you drum out more and can help change the way in which you interact with the economy. Some of the great philanthropists of the 19th and 20th century, my mind immediately goes to Andrew Carnegie, obviously founded the Carnegie Peace Endowment, but said he will not go to the grave with a single penny on his body. He was very generous, very opulent in how he gave back to communities and was very much about supporting civil society. And he used his wealth and fortune to do exactly that and to honor God, I think, you know, in that aspect. So, so again, I don't think it's an issue of embedding religion within economics. I think it's more of an issue of the state doing so. We just did a piece of research at the Adam Smith Institute into Islamic finance. Now, Islamic finance is very interesting. It's one of those get-arounds. How do you charge interest without charging interest? Because obviously that's forbidden. Usury is forbidden in the Quran, and it's forbidden in, you know, I think it's the Old Testament as well. Jesus obviously beating the moneylenders out of the temple it comes to mind on that one. So they have something called shura. It's I've forgotten the name for it now. There is a way in which financing, in the way in which you can structure your finances so that you can get a return on the money you loan whilst it being halal. And you do need accreditation from a spiritual leader or a mosque or a council to do so, but it's done entirely out of the purview of the state. This is fantastic, great. This is a new innovation on finance. It really took off in the 1960s and 70s in the Middle East. This is how, you know, religious people can go about doing business whilst also honoring their spiritual commitments. And it's proven immensely popular in the Middle East. It's proving immensely popular in the Far East, in Malaysia and Indonesia. Obviously, Indonesia having the most number of Muslims in a country. And it's taking off in the UK as well, under the guise, and here's the innovation, under the guise of more ethical capitalism. So some people don't want to be invested in oil, they don't want to invest in weapons, fine. A lot of mainstream banking, unfortunately for them, is invested in these dirty product services. So there are cooperatives that are essentially set up that don't charge interest, give you more control over your finances, and that they are essentially permitted to act in that ethical, that spiritual way. Their main problem, and this is why I wrote the paper, I thought it was very interesting, is they're not licensed to operate as banks because you need a banking license. And the UK does not like issuing new banking licenses. So there are lots of new innovations that come about from that spiritual aspect, that engagement with the economy, and I think that deserves a lot more study.
If I may add something, I think one of the biggest dangers of focusing on religious values, Christian virtues, things like that, I think is that there are some self-harm, some self-sacrificial virtues in Christianity, at least according to the mainstream interpretation, I would call it. And if there is a big risk that leftists, socialists come in afterwards, after we have fought for these self-sacrificial principles, that they come in and outperform us in self-sacrifice and self-harm. I think this could be very damaging for society and for an economy if that happens, and by the way, it happens currently.
But that would be a perversion of a Christian virtue. It wouldn't.
Sorry?
That would be a perverted Christian virtue.
Probably.
So to your point, totally agree with you. So I think the material flourishing of civilizations goes, hand in hand with the underlying moral principles, and that's why the West has some good things and bad things. But I will make the case that it's better than any other competing civilization, both materially and morally. Right, the greatest degree of economic development, and also the greatest kind of the summit of rights and freedoms. I would say. Now, for some time, the material progress or the flourishing of civilizations can be way higher than the moral foundations when these decay, right? But that progress, that material progress, if so, it doesn't withstand the test of time. And this is what we are seeing today. So Europe, for instance, is not competitive in the world stage. And part of it is because of we've forgotten those moral foundations. And part of it is because of the ungratefulness of their own, meaning us, and also the barbarians always, waiting at the gates. Okay, in this case, competing, superpowers, regions of the world, etc. Now, when it comes to outperforming ourselves, or the left, capturing some Christian virtues and kind of instrumentalizing or weaponizing them, that doesn't mean that the Christian virtue is intrinsically or instrumentally evil or flawed. It means that that virtue and virtue signaling in this case is always prone to capture, and we should also we should remain in that moral stage so that we understand when morality is being perverted. Because, for instance, when it comes to identity politics, so identity politics is based on the notion of victimhood. Well, the only civilization on earth that has ever praised the ultimate victim is Christianity. Across history, what you try to imitate is the powerful, the wealthy, the strong, that's the go-to guy. I want to be like him, right? Christians, however, do quite the opposite. The one that has been humiliated, who has been, who has died naked on a cross, right? So without a Christian kind of ecosystem, this virtue signaling, this identity politics of victimhood would have never, rise, I guess. And it hasn't in other civilizations. So that gives you a hint, okay? But again, that's not the problem of a Christian virtue. That's a problem of, Christians forgetting what the right meaning of those virtues is, I think.
I agree.
Is Herr Nietzsche in the room with us now? You know? Any more questions?
Exhausted.
Exhausted. Fine, we're going to wrap up. Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Let's go. So when's lunchtime, Robert? 15 minutes? Okay. See each other in lunch. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.